Chapter 16. Hard Bodies at the Hard Rock Cafe. A much more relieved Katie started her trek to return to the hotel to get dressed and ready for her night out with Sean and Kathy. Knowing that parking on Broadway is near impossible, she thought it would be easier to walk, as it was less than a mile from the Renaissance Hotel to the Hard Rock Cafe, especially cutting through some parking lots and alleys. She presumed if she walked fast enough, kept her head down, and did not make eye contact with anyone, she could convince herself that she would be invisible to the thousands of people who walk up and down Broadway on any given night in Nashville. Within 10 minutes, she was entering the Hard Rock Cafe, and no one was the wiser as she hid behind her full auburn locks. Sean was first to spot Katie, hiding behind her hair, and he quickly shuffled her over to a quiet table and the corner, keeping Katie's back to the crowd. They were having a wonderful time, and the two firecrackers were bonding beautifully. A few drinks later, Katie thought it best to dilute the spirits in her as she had been drinking alcohol, but switching out a black straw for a clear straw to mask what was in her glass. Every once in a while, all the pressure of living in a glass house at all times would get to Katie, and she had to let her hair down. Her days of taking her clothes off ceased, as she never drank more than one on a regular occasion, or two on a really stressful time. Unbeknownst to Katie, Sean, and Kathy, Tim had arrived at the Hard Rock Cafe shortly after Katie. He had a well-thought-out plan and approached one of his lesser distinguished friends, a big brute of a guy. He paid him to go over to Katie and insist that she dances with him, by way of manhandling her. He was then to pick her up and whisk her outside when the music was at its loudest. Tim's plan was to rescue her from the brute, thus getting in good with Katie. He never anticipated Katie's guarded nature and that she suspected everyone of up to no good in situations like that. Tim pulled over Big Billy and gave him explicit instructions. "Now, whatever you do, after you get a firm hold of her, call her some derogatory name. Then as quickly as you can, take her through the kitchen out the back door. I'll rescue her from you in the back alley. Then get lost for the night, and tomorrow, all your drinks are on me." "Got it." Tim had noted who she was with, and he hid behind the crowds of people to block himself from Sean's view. Sean knew him well, and his reputation with the ladies. If Tim was going to get a shot at Katie, this was it. Sean kept peeking over at Katie, who was chatting with a lady at the bar. There were many eyes on her, as she drew attention pretty much wherever she went. Sean, Tim, and Billy weren't the only ones keeping their eyes on her. A thin, young man in his mid-30s with short-cropped black hair was watching Tim and his friend watch Katie. Nashville was a big city and a small town at the same time. He saw deviousness in Tim's eyes when Tim gave Billy the signal. The big man meandered his way over to Katie. At first, he was very polite and offered to buy her a drink. She turned him down. Tim had moved behind some other people, careful to stay out of the point of vision of Sean and Kathy. The bigger man's body shadowed Katie's so the thin man could not see, nor hear the altercation. Oh, Sean said. "What?" "I think I saw Kyle." "Are you sure?" "No, I can't see him now. He better not be here." While he was searching for Kyle, Kathy joined in the search, and they took their eyes off watching Katie, in just enough time for the brute to force her onto the dance floor. When she started to protest, he pulled her into the kitchen, making like she was his drunk girlfriend and he had to take her out and sober her up. No one paid all that much attention as it happened so fast. His large hand covered most of Katie's thin face. Tim quickly followed the protesting Katie. The band was playing loud enough to muffle Katie's protests. Sean and Kathy continued to peruse the crowd. Sean arose from his seat and yelled back at Kathy while dodging his way through the mix of bodies. "I think I see him, get Nick down here, quick." "Where's Katie?" Kathy called to him as she arose to search for Katie. Sean made his way back to Kathy. "I don't know. I can't see her. It's too crowded and she's so small." The brute had Katie picked up and was holding her mouth closed, while he carried her kicking with muffled screams. Terror gripped her heart and put her into an absolute panic. This was the most perilous situation she had been in since that day on the bridge. She desperately wanted her Scotty now. He wasn't in Tennessee, but Nick was, yet he had dumped her, because of her inability to leave Scotty high and dry. Now she was in the arms of a stranger, a bully, a man who now had her life in his hands and could do anything he wanted with it. Sean moved toward the dance floor, but was intercepted by a number of people, some planted, some not. Kathy faced the same obstacles. Billy carried her out back to a small cement alcove, to the side of the building, with stairs going down to a basement. He held her up with ease, and he put her back against the building, with her feet lifted off the ground, holding her up with his hand over her mouth. He looked around the corner and Billy got the signal to put her down and take his hand off her mouth. As Nick, Annie, Jeannie, and Andy were relaxing in the living room, Nick's phone went off with a text message from Kathy. "Kyle here at Hard Rock Cafe, can't see Katie, she could be dancing, better come." Nick reached in his back pocket and read the text from Kathy. "Oh shit, he's at the Hard Rock Cafe, I knew it," Nick said to Annie. "I knew he'd try something like this," he said with fury growing exponentially. "Who?" Andy asked. "Your son, he's at the Hard Rock Cafe, and Katie's there. Sean is trying to see who she is with. Now, I'm sure that she's fine and Kyle wouldn't do anything to hurt her," Andy said as he pulled Nick's arm back when he started to leave. Annie grabbed her coat and Nick's keys, which were on the dining room table. Nick tugged at his arm. "Let go of my arm, I'm going to bust his ass." "Nick, you don't need to be in another fight, now." Andy held on tight to Nick's sleeve. Nick shoved Andy so that he fell back, letting go. "Nicholas Paul!" Jeannie yelled as she ran to Andy's side. Nick received another text from Kathy. "Can't find Katie, anywhere, hurry." "Shit, Annie, they can't find her, now. I'm going to kill that bastard if he touches her." Nick and Annie bolted for his truck. He sped all the way there. It was only about a 10-minute drive, and Nick was determined to make it 5. While Nick raced to the Hard Rock Cafe, Katie kicked and screamed with everything she had, while the brute had her nearly picked up off the ground, being held against a cement wall. He had covered Katie's mouth with the other hand, so her screams went muffled, again. Tim came running around the corner, and got between Katie and Billy, shoving Billy, hitting him in the face. Katie began her screaming, again, only this time, she got in a few good yelps, before Tim covered her mouth to calm her. Billy took off, not expecting to be hit. Tim turned quickly to Katie to calm her down. "Shoo. It's okay, he's gone. Are you okay?" He had a firm grip on Katie, pushed up against the wall. Katie was taking in deep breaths and crying. Her body was tense and trembling. She pulled her arms in and hugged her waist. Tim got in closer to try to calm her still. He pulled his hand from her mouth, giving Katie another opportunity to scream for help from her captor. "Get away from me, right now," she yelled in a crying voice. Tim put his arm up against the cement wall, trapping her. He rubbed her arm with his other hand, then he put his hand on her mouth, because she kept yelling at him. "Shoo. I'm not going to hurt you. I saw that guy manhandling you, and I chased him, he's gone." Katie pushed and struggled, yelling at Tim. She punched Tim, breaking the hold he had over her mouth. "Get away from me, you set that up, get away from me, let me go," she screamed, pushing him. "I'm not going to hurt you, Cat." "Yeah, but I'm going to hurt you, if you don't get your ass the hell away from her," the thin stranger with the short-cropped, near black hair said. Tim turned to see this man who grabbed his arm. "Buddy, I just helped her, bug off and mind your own business." "That's bullshit, asshole, get out of here." At this point, Katie didn't know who to believe, so she just yelled for help. Her rescuer grabbed Tim by his sleeve, causing him to lose his balance, thus pulling him away from Katie, but not far enough for her to escape between them. Her rescuer was about 5 feet 10 inches, slightly taller than Tim, but not near as muscular. He had a thinner, lankier build, yet with all his anger, he was able to at least get in one ineffective shot at Tim. "Buddy, take your hands off me. You know I can take you. You're getting older and slower, so give it your best shot, asshole." He was shoving Tim, but when Tim got his balance, the strength in his legs overpowered the thinner man's legs. Thus Tim had the upper hand and was pushing the man up toward the wall next to Katie in the alcove. Buddy gave Tim one last shove, which only freed him a millisecond, and angered Buddy even more. Tim had the man by the neck, and up against the wall, choking him, right as Katie watched. She went to grab at Tim's left arm, but his right arm shoved her at her collarbone, pinning her also. "Buddy, I don't want to fight you, you need that pretty face, and those hands for your guitar wielding. You know I can break both." "Not if I break every bone in your slimy little body, asshole," an angry, rich baritone voice said, entering the equation. A quick moment of relief immediately washed over Katie, and an impending sense of security befell her as she turned to see the source of that sweet sound. Nick took a hold of Tim's shirt, he pulled him off Buddy, dragged him out about 10 feet into the parking lot and proceeded to wail on his face, getting in several furious blows to his face. Buddy lunged over toward Nick while he was beating Tim. "Nick, stop. Stop." Buddy grabbed a hold of Nick's fist, giving Tim time to get up and run. Nick stood straight up, yanking his arm from Buddy as rage and hatred pounded in his heart toward that man for touching his teach. His body jerked as he came back to the present, watching Tim run. His breathing was fast and furious as his attention was drawn from Tim to his former best friend, Buddy Asher. Sean and Kathy had entered the scene seconds after Nick and rushed to Katie, holding her and inspecting her for injuries. "Thanks pal," Buddy said to Nick. Buddy patted Nick on the back of his shoulders. "You okay, Buddy?" Nick asked. His eyes then flew toward where Katie was, and he saw her surrounded by Sean and Kathy. He began to move toward her slowly, calming himself. When Annie heard Nick ask her former love about his state of being, she approached him, also grateful for his assistance. "Are you sure you're not hurt, Buddy?" Annie asked as she checked him over for injuries. She put her hand on his chest, looking at his arms, and inspecting his reddened neck. She rubbed his neck. "Can you breathe all right?" Buddy took Annie's hands, holding them lovingly to his chest, missing the feel of them in his hands. He looked into her eyes and began to breathe deeper with her that close to him. After all this time, she could still do it to him. Married for nearly 4 years, and she still could bring him to that point. Nick stared at Katie, and she at him. Nick's mind and heart was racing to Katie's side, but his body was slowly with great self-control progressing toward her. Sean and Kathy moved away the closer Nick got to Katie. Her body was quivering from the residual fear, his was trembling from the residual panic of his teach being missing for those 5 minutes, which might as well have been 5 hours. She was breathing heavy from the shock and fear, while Nick was breathing heavy from the rage inside of him. He stood about 4 feet away from her, but his heart was all over her. She was begging him with her eyes to cover her, but he wasn't reading her face, afraid and completely clueless as to what would be the proper response. "Are you okay?" A combination of fury and fright kept Nick's voice broken and shaky. She nodded. Nick lifted her arms to inspect her for bruising. She did not pull away from the feel of his skin touching her. She watched his hands on her arms, when what she wanted was his arms all around protecting, comforting and just plain loving her. "I'm not hurt," she said. "Just a little freaked out and scared." "Well, maybe a lot freaked out and scared." He stood there wanting to take her in his arms, squeezing her into him as if to have her meld into him. With every passing second that he did not grab her into him, the tears behind her eyes began to swell, until as if a dam were to burst. She put her face in her hands. "What do you want me to do, Katie?" "Cover me," she said into her hands, whimpering. He immediately took a giant step toward her and whisked her into his arms. "Oh, Nicholas Paul, thank you for coming for me." Are you kidding? The very second that I heard that asshole was there at the same time as you, my head was already out the door and, in my truck, but when Kathy texted me that they couldn't find you, my heart was right here, before I could even get my key in the ignition. Safety wrapped Katie up into Nick and stirred in her an undeniable sense of crazy love in her for him. Being in his arms was safe, good, warm, and where she belonged. Buddy watched Nick holding on to Katie for dear life. When Nick raised his eyes, he became intensely grateful to his former best friend for offering up his own body as a sacrifice for the love of his life. You sure you're okay, buddy? Yeah, I'm fine, he's quicker than I thought, the thin and lanky man said. I'm going to kill that bastard, Annie, the next time he shows his face up at the house, I mean it. Katie popped her head out of the hug but left the rest of her body safely tucked in Nick's arms. The next time he shows up at whose house? She asked with fear. My parents or Gran's. Why would he do that? Katie, don't you know who that was? Annie asked. He said his name was Tim, that's all I knew. Katie, that's Kyle, Nick said. Timothy Kyle Williamson, that bastard, Nick added, knowing that he did not give her his name, by which he's known to trick her. Katie put her hand to her mouth from increased fear. He pretended to not know me, but he knows me, doesn't he? That means he has been following me, even from earlier today in the parking lot. What do you mean he's been following you from earlier in the parking lot? Nick's eyes burst open wide. Jay had just arrived at the Hard Rock Cafe, and he had heard that there was some kind of fight. Within seconds, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, followed by 2 more. 3 officers hastened out of their cruisers and made a quick dash for the center of the circle. 2 officers began to break up the crowd. Jay forced his way through the crowd, only to be stopped by an officer. Back it up, buddy. I'm her manager, Jay Pennington. He reached in his back pocket to pull out his wallet. Sean darted over to assist Jay. He's her manager and friend, let him through. Nick was questioning Katie, nearly yelling at her. What do you mean he's been following you? Hold on, pal, back off. An officer pulled Nick away as if to arrest him. Jay moved in toward her, and Katie looked around him, ignoring his presence to watch what the cop was doing with Nick. Officer, please let go, don't arrest him. He's a friend. When Katie said that, their eyes again locked. The cop let go of Nick, who then shoved the officer to get near Katie, panicked about the information she told him about Kyle stalking her. Did he have his hands on you? Katie, tell me, what do you mean he's been following you? Nick asked. Back off, I said, the officer said to a furious Nick, pulling him back from crowding Katie. Nick, calm down, Annie said, getting closer to him. She put her hands on his waist and turned his face toward her. Look at me, calm down, or you're going to end up in jail. Haven't you been busted enough this year? The officer spun around when Annie said that. Oh crap. Buddy quickly covered for Annie's mistake. It's okay, officer. Nick here is a good friend, that man who had me pinned is Kyle Williamson, who is their stepbrother. He had this lady pinned up against the cement wall over there and would not let her go, claiming he was rescuing her from the bigger guy. Nick's body jerked forward again, but this time to Buddy. His muscles contracted, his fists were up and ready to kill someone. What bigger guy? Nick asked with panic rising in the back of his throat. The one that carried her out here, I saw it and I came running out, Buddy said. I couldn't get through the crowd, so I went out the front door and ran around back here. Nick yelled and questioned both. Buddy, what bigger guy? It was Billy Henry, you know, that jackass, who used to be the bouncer at Coyote Ugly, but he got arrested for assault, then fired. Okay, so you know his name, and your name is? An officer asked. I'm Blake Sloan Asher, but most people call me Buddy. I saw him pick her up, off the dance floor, and take her out through the kitchen. Kyle pulled Billy off Katie, then punched him out. Then he trapped Katie, trying to calm her down, but it was obviously a setup. Kyle's half the size of Billy. I don't think Billy expected to be hit, but it's obvious he was set up to overpower this lady here. Alright, I want all your names, including the assailants and their addresses, if you can give them. My stepbrother, Timothy Kyle Williamson, is the mastermind of this. I'll bet anything you can find him at my parents' right now, pulling some sob story with his dad, my stepdad, right Annie? Yeah, the address is 6513 Old Pleasant Drive. I bet he's there, Annie said. One of the officers leaned into his radio to have an additional unit dispatched to that address. You better put him behind bars, 'cause I'm going to kill him if you don't, Nick said. Pal, one more outburst, and if you don't calm down, I'm going to take you in. Katie walked over to Nick and took him to the fence. She put him up against the fence, and her hand on his chest to calm him, giving him a jolt and refocusing him on her, instead of his wrath against Kyle. Nick, you gotta calm down, please. Nick put his hand on hers, which lay on his chest, lost in a gaze. Please. It was all he could do to contain his emotions. He looked down and just stared at her, lost in her from her touch. There were cameras taking pictures and a news crew had shown up. Damn, another media storm, Katie said as a flash blinded both of them for a second. Officers, we need to take this somewhere else. It's going to get crazy. This is Katie Lynn Moore. She's very well known, can we protect her from all of this? Alright, do you want to meet us at the station? The officer asked. Katie nodded. Buddy, we need you, Annie said. I'll come. I'm coming, Jay said. Okay, let's go. Do you want to ride in the cruiser, Mrs. Moore? No, please, no more attention than necessary. Jay, you take me. Annie, take him somewhere and calm him down. She said, referring to Nick. No way, I'm going to that station. I want to know what you mean by he's been following you. Jay, we'll all go, in my vehicle, the windows are tinted. You can't see in. Jay nodded and took Katie by the hand. Jay got in the front passenger seat after Nick led the way. He opened the back passenger door, staring her down. She noted the anger in his glare. Annie got in the other back passenger door. Katie knew that she was going to have to explain going out by herself, and Jay and Nick would be furious. Mr. Thomas, do not question her on the way, one of the officers said. We'll escort you both. No lights, please? Katie asked as she turned back. I'll make sure he doesn't say anything, Jay said. You either, Mr. Pennington. The officer said. The ride to the station was silent. Annie held Katie while she quietly sobbed in Annie's shoulder. No one was allowed to speak. Both Jay and Nick were angry, but not sure who they were angry with, Kyle, Billy and Katie, or just Kyle and Billy. Jay broke the silence. Oh, Katie, here's your phone, the people at the church called me. Nick glared at her, in the rearview mirror, growing all that more frustrated at what he found out about her running off by herself, again. Her sheepish eyes made their way up to meet his, and she knew she had a lot of explaining to do. You didn't have your phone, either? Nick said, raising his voice. She dropped her head, knowing this was her fault, for not following directions by going out alone when she knew it wasn't safe, especially without her phone. Nick, you can't be threatening Kyle like that, especially in front of an officer. Knowing him, he'll get himself beat up, blame you, and they've got you threatening him. God, I hope he doesn't pull that. Would he do that? Jay asked, fearful of Nick's well-being. What, did you miss the rape history on Kyle? What rape history? Jay asked. Not so thorough, are you? Nick said with sarcasm. Nick, that's because there is no record. Your arrest was expunged when she recanted, Annie said. Hold on, you were arrested for what? Katie's breathing became labored and quick. She eyed Annie, who also exposed some fear in her face. Kyle date raped a girl in high school when Nick was 17 and he threatened the girl. He said that he would not only harm her but get to her shotgun father and spill the beans that she was pregnant. No one knows who the baby's father was. She was already pregnant when Kyle raped her. She claimed it was Nick, and when our stepsister found out, she forced Kyle's hand, and the girl recanted when Kyle told her to, but there was hell to pay all during that. Are there witnesses? None that will come forward. Doesn't matter, statutes of limitation ran out a long time ago, Nick said. So, you got charged? I was falsely charged, and when she recanted, she said it was her boyfriend, but he was long gone by then. Kyle got off, but my reputation was shot. Most of our friends and acquaintances knew Kyle, and they knew his history. Jay shook his head. Missed that one, didn't you? If there was no record, yeah. But I'm worried about this Kyle guy. Yes, so was I, and that was why I told Katie to stay away from him. I didn't know it was him. He said his name was Tim. I never studied a picture of Kyle. Where were you when you saw him? Nick asked, looking in the rear view. Nick, the cop said don't question her, Annie said, pulling Katie in closer. Silence and tension filled the air in Nick's Escalade for the remaining 5-minute ride to the police station. Katie filled the police in on the details of Tim at the Opryland Hotel, including the flat tire, while Nick, Jay, and Annie listened. The more she spoke, the angrier Jay became at Katie for taking off like that, lying about her whereabouts and not seeing that she had a phone with her, and the more afraid for her, Nick became. Annie was worried about what Nick was going to do to Kyle. The expedition was towed for the investigation of the tire, and to be checked for fingerprints and looked at for tampering. Jay called Matthew and Becca and filled them in on the details. Scotty became very upset, and Matthew calmed him by relating that Nick was there. They were not aware of the current non-friend relationship status of Nick and Katie. After everyone was questioned, and a file was opened, they all left the stations and meandered out to the front sidewalk of the police station. Standing on the sidewalk, Nick decided to stand his ground. He wasn't going to throw himself on Katie, but he was going to make sure she was safe. He approached Jay to make sure Katie would be safe while she was in Nashville. Jay, she needs a bodyguard, and you need to get one on her right away. Katie heard Nick demand a bodyguard for her, meaning he did not want to be it. If you don't hire one immediately, I will. I promised Scotty she'd be safe. As long as she's here, she needs to be watched. I'll have one tomorrow. No, I don't want anyone following me around wherever I go. I won't have it. You have no choice anymore, Sean said with his hand on her shoulder. Katie backed away from the group. I always have a choice, she said with her hands on her hips. I'll take off, and this time you won't find me, none of you. Nick and Jay shook their heads. Well, Nick, either you keep her tonight and take her out to your grandparents', where the coyotes will keep her in the house, or I can, in my hotel room. I'll just have to stay awake the whole night, Jay said, looking down at her as if reprimanding a runaway teen. I hate this life, Katie said, crying. I hate you, Jason Pennington, I hate you. You planned this all for your stupid foundation, she said as she walked away to talk to Kathy and Annie. Nick watched Katie scuff her feet while moving over toward Kathy and Annie. He saw Kathy holding her, wishing it was he who had her in his arms. While Kathy was attempting to calm Katie and talk some sense into her, Annie wandered over toward Buddy, who was staring at her a few feet away. Nick watched his sister, remembering what she said about Buddy's effect on her, to this day. Buddy, thank you so much, for what you did. Annie gave him an uncomfortable smile and a hug. She breathed in a little deeper, still affected by him. Buddy was definitely jolt-driven by Annie's touch. You're welcome. I'm glad I was there. I hate that guy, your stepbrother. I remember going a few rounds with him, when we were. Annie shook her head. I hear you're going to have a baby, congratulations. I'm sure you'll make a beautiful baby, and that husband of yours, the doctor guy? Ray, his name is Ray. Right, well, you tell him I said congratulations, and he's one hell of a lucky guy. He wasn't lucky, Buddy, he was faithful. Buddy put his head down and nodded. He chuckled a sad laugh. What about you? Is there anyone in your life? No one special, nor will there ever be, again. I'm going to have to settle for second best, because I lost my best girl. Annie sighed and shook her head. I'm sorry, I gotta go. You take care, she said. Buddy looked up at Nick a few feet away, and Nick approached him. Buddy, I can't thank you enough. Buddy looked at Annie as she walked away. He pointed his chin toward her. Is she happy with that guy, Nick? Nick looked behind him at Annie, who had glanced back at Buddy and Nick talking. She made eye contact with Nick. Yeah, Ray's a great guy and he treats her very well, when he's around. He works a lot, which leaves her alone, but with the baby coming, I think he may start to cut back on his hours, I hope. Buddy sighed out regret for losing the one great love of his life with his playboy ways as a country music artist. With groupies galore, Buddy found the compulsion just past what he could bear to say no, and with 2 incidents under his belt, there was no way he would be able to win Annie back, leaving the pathway open for Ray. I miss you, pal. Buddy put his hands in his pockets. I miss you too, Buddy. Not only did I lose my best girl, I lost my best friend. I'm sorry I turned my back on you. No, you were right too. I really hurt your sister. You needed to support her. I was the jerk. So, what's the deal with the author? Are you too hot and heavy? Nick turned and looked at Katie, who eyed him back as the 3 women spoke. Nah, she's pretty tied up with that trooper. I know you, bro, and you're wishing it weren't that way. She's the one for you, isn't she? Nick nodded, catching one more glimpse. You know me too well, and I'm not very good at hiding it. I'll tell you a secret, she's my Cindy from the liner notes, if you can believe that, he said, referring to Nick and Katie's well-known former rivalry. Buddy tilted his head and raised one eyebrow. It's a long story. I'll have to catch you up on what an idiot I've been. Please don't tell anyone. She's really sensitive, and I have issues with a groupie. The whack job? Nick nodded. Word gets around, huh? Nah, I've just been following you. So, she knows how you feel about her? Nick nodded, while watching her. Well, if you win her back, don't screw it up, again, like I did. You may lose more than just your jolt giver, pal. Nick turned and faced Buddy, noting the nostalgia and regret. Buddy, let's get together, soon. 20 years is a long time to be friends, there's too much there that we've shared. That sounds great. I'll call ya, maybe we can work out a plan to win her away from the trooper. Buddy said, looking at Katie. It's a lot more complicated than that. We'll get together, I'll fill you in. Nick put his hand out for a man handshake, like they used to, then a brief man hug. Well, please give my regards to your gran and gramps, I miss them, also. I doubt your mother misses me, he said with a sad chortle. Nick nodded and tilted his head back and forth, knowing how his mother could hold a grudge better than anyone. Gran and gramps miss you. They loved you, and ask about you, now and again. Maybe I'll stop in on them, sometime when Annie's not around. I know they'd love that, Buddy. Really, they would. Buddy looked at Annie one more time and waved goodbye. She smiled and waved, then looked at Nick. Nick could read the both of them, both living in some form or regret. Buddy let his jolt giver go, Nick's mother lost hers, and he pushed his away by putting too much pressure on her, after promising not to. Sean was so right about his selfishness. If he could have just been more patient, things may have worked out between them. Katie was drawing close to him, and he blew it by making her choose. Kathy's words rung in Nick's ears like wisdom's echo. If it were up to him, he'd sweep her up in his arms and whisk her off to his gran and gramps, but Kathy's advice was well heeded. When he approached Jay and Sean, Jay asked Nick if he decided which was best. You take her, Jay, just keep an eye on her, don't let her leave. Slam. That was it, Katie heard Nick pass her off to Jay. This was his chance to keep her, as her bodyguard tonight, and he passed her off to Jay. He really wasn't bluffing about not wanting to be second in her life. He was going to really walk away. Annie came back to Katie and Kathy to soothe and comfort Katie. She saw her staring at Nick, while Nick picked up his eyes, getting a wanton glimpse of his one and only true love. "Go talk to him," Kathy said to Katie. She shook her head. "This is for the best. I'm better off with Scotty, and Scotty needs me more than he does." "Oh, I doubt that. I know my brother. I doubt he'll be able to sing another note without you." Katie looked up at Annie, as Jay approached Katie. Jay spoke to Katie, while her eyes were on Nick walking toward his Escalade. Sean ran up to catch up with him. "Where you going, dude?" "Home, Sean. Go and talk to her, take her out to your gran's, she loves it out there." Nick shook his head. "No, Kathy's right. She doesn't want me, she wants Scotty, at least she thinks she does. As much as I hate it, I'm going to take your wife's advice and wait for her to decide who she really wants," Nick said, putting his hands on his hips, clasping his belt. "Bro, she can't have him." Nick's eyes floated from being locked onto Sean's to catching a glimpse at Katie as she watched the two men speaking. There was a sadness in his stare that Katie could pick up from a dozen or so feet away. It permeated her soul. Well, she wants him. I don't trust her now. Funny twist of fate, now, isn't it? Nick shrugged his shoulders. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She saw Nick shake his head, give her one last glance, give Sean a man hug, and then he got into his Escalade. Sean sighed and shook his head as he wound his way back over to the group remaining. "Where do you want to go, Katie?" Jay asked. "Well, apparently, the hotel is my only choice," she said as she watched the back of his vehicle disappear into the darkness. "You can come to our house," Sean said. Katie shook her head. "Nah, thanks. I think I just want to be alone, I'm tired." Sean and Kathy drove them all back to the Hard Rock. Jay questioned Katie in the back seat of Sean's Sequoia. "Why did Nick drive away without you?" Jay asked. Sean looked back at Katie in the rearview mirror and she eyed Sean, assuming he knew. "Because he gave me an ultimatum, and he didn't like my answer." Jay shook his head. "Stupid choice on his part. I thought that you two were just going to be friends, for now, taking things slowly." She put her fingers to her mouth, chewing on her fingernails, and spoke the answer into her window. "He couldn't be my friend. He wants what I can't give him." Jay looked toward the front at Sean and Kathy, who looked at each other. The rest of the car ride was tense and quiet. Nick drove around the city, not wanting or able to leave it to go out to the country. For as long as Katie was in Nashville, and Kyle was out and about, he did not feel comfortable. It was all he could do to keep from going to Kyle's and beating the breath out of his lungs. As he drove around, his eyes were magnetically drawn to his phone with Katie's number prompted in it, already. As it rested on the center console, it seemed to be calling out to him, as if it wanted to be utilized as a lifeline to Nick's jolt giver. Each temptation became stronger and every excuse he made in his head became more and more feeble. When Jay and Katie got to the hotel, Katie gave Jay her word to stay locked in her own room, as she was frightened beyond measure this night, being carried away by the brute. She never felt more alone than that night. Most nights she wanted to be alone, this night was different. She laid down, staring up at the ceiling and kept hearing that wonderful baritone voice that came to her rescue. "Not if I break every bone in your slimy body, asshole." When she laid down on her bed, she sighed, wishing Nick had said more to her and held her longer. She longed to have that feeling she had earlier in his arms. She was surprised that he stuck to his guns. If he had just asked her again, she would have chosen different, but she threw her one chance away. As she started to drift off to sleep, the face of the man who carried her off flashed before her eyelids. She began to see images of him carrying her into a dark abyss where she heard the voices of her father and mother, and it frightened her. She then saw an image of Kimmy in the darkness, and the man was taking her to her, also. Her phone woke her with a start, and she jumped out of bed to get it. Hello? She said in sort of a panic. Katie, are you okay? She worked at trying to catch her breath as she attempted to clear her memory of the nightmare. Hey, are you there? Are you okay? It was that wonderful voice again, soothing her. No, she said with a shaky voice. What's the matter? Are you alone? Is someone there? Are you in danger? Is it Kyle? He continued to pelt her with questions. I'm alone, in my hotel room. I just fell asleep and had a nightmare. That's all. Why are you calling me? I was worried about you. I wanted to know that you were safe. She curled up in fetal position, talking to Nick on the phone, fighting the urge to ask him to come to her, and a little disturbed at the pressure he had put on her the day before. Oh, like a friend checking up on another friend? Or a jilted lover doing a little stalking of his own? No, just as a friend worried about another friend who was terribly frightened tonight. I'm headed out of town, I just wanted to check and see if you needed anything. Out of town? Yeah, to my place. I live about 30 miles out. I just wanted to check. I mean, I imagine Jay can get you everything you need. I just wanted to make sure that you were okay. Does it really matter if I'm okay or not? Yes, it matters to me. Well, I'm not. Katie started to cry, still frightened from the evening's events. What's wrong? Do you know what it's like to be forcibly picked up by this big bully, with his hand covering your mouth, and no one sees or stops him? She had no time to process the fear of being forcibly taken out of the Hard Rock Cafe, by way of a big brute carrying her. Nick was too busy focused on his own fury that he forgot to think of how scared she must have been. He was always so used to her being a rebellious firecracker, he forgot she was a vulnerable little woman. Katie? What? What do you need? A friend. That was as much invitation as he needed. Would a tortoise-brained friend suffice? That's the best kind, they make me feel smart, she cackled. Nick chortled. I'll be there in a couple of minutes. Approximately 5 minutes later, there was a knock on Katie's hotel room door. She did not even have time to change, she was busy trying to wash away the tears and freshen her tear-soaked cheeks. No, that can't be him, already. She looked at her phone to see how much time had passed. The peephole was above her eye level as most were. He knocked again, as she stood by the other side of the door a little apprehensive. Katie, it's me, Nicholas Paul, a muffled baritone said into the door, relieving Katie of any residual fear. She opened the door, to the most beautiful face, but with only half the Texas-sized grin he usually offered, and dimples barely noticeable. He was visibly nervous and apprehensive about what to say to her to make her feel better. Boy, when you say a couple of minutes you ain't kidding, she said cackling, and backed away from the door. She turned and walked toward the bathroom to put on some makeup. He closed the door and admired her casual wear. What were you circling the parking garage when you called? She asked with her voice somewhat muffled behind a half-closed door. He lowered his head and raised his eyes, but remained silent. She opened the bathroom door slightly more, and looked at him when he did not comment, and saw his coy expression. She tilted her head, waiting for his defense. Truth be told, I was in the lobby. I took the long way around and the stairs, very slowly, so as to not look too obvious, and I even waited a moment before I knocked. Katie started laughing, thrilled that his being in the lobby proved to her that he loved her that much. And only a tortoise-brained friend would admit to that, but no pressure, right? She said, teasing him. He chuckled and dropped his head in embarrassment.